If I'm photographing families or a very structured portrait setting, either in studio or out on location, I'll go to manual and I'll use my light meter, my handheld light meter, and make very accurate exposures and go from there. But I do use aperture priority quite a bit. Now, let me explain how your in-camera light meter works. And I think a lot of people don't understand this and they make mistakes all the time, and I want to clarify a few things. You'll see on the screen a gray canvas. Your camera, your in-camera light meter has to make a decision. When it reads a scene, it doesn't know much about tones. It can't make a subjective interpretive decision for you because it's a computer program built into the camera. And light meters have been working that way since, well, you know, I remember my first camera in 1975, an old Canon FTB or a TLB or something like that. You know, I would turn the aperture and there was a dial, a circle in the middle, and the needle would float, and I'd have to line up the needle in the middle of the circle to get an exposure. And it's the same principles that apply today. It's really a lot of the same principles that apply back in the days of Ansel Adams when you're talking about the zone system and you're creating accurate exposures. So the camera wants to take your scene. Now look at this canvas. Now if this was a white wall, your camera on aperture priority or on any auto setting by default wants to turn it to a mid-range exposure. So if it's a white wall, it'll turn it to a mid-gray. That's its job. That's what the computer in the camera, it has to make some sort of a decision. And likewise, if it's a black wall, it wants to lighten it. So it wants to have an average. Now if I open up the levels, you can see, all right, levels are not working here. Let's just go there. You could see right in the middle here is where all my tones are. All right, and that happens to be, well, let's see, your tones range from 0 to 255, so that happens to be 127.5. So either exactly at 127.5 or thereabouts, your camera meter wants to take any particular scene and throw it in that range. All right, so let me show you a couple examples here. Actually, let me just give you a warning. There's just something I hear all the time, and I think this is a really big mistake. And that is, I hear people say, well, you know, I can use raw and go compensate later and pull in my tones because I can pull up to 3 tones under or over exposure and get pretty good results that way. Well, I think that that's a big mistake, and there's 2 reasons why I think that that's a big mistake. The first reason is that you're really not doing yourself a favor. When you were learning how to get accurate exposures, using that most powerful of all computers, the one between your ears, when you look at a scene and you learn how to get a good exposure, you're becoming a better photographer. You're learning how to really look at a scene and evaluate a scene and know exactly how to get good exposures and lay them down. And this is the same as what the zone system back in the days of old, when, you know, they used spot meters and read the tones and lay down that exposure onto negatives, and of course they would pull out the tones again using chemical processing. We don't have to do that nowadays, but the same principles apply in digital. Okay, so if I'm shooting a black wall, it wants to go gray. If I'm shooting a white wall, it'll adjust the exposure to go gray. Okay, let's look at some actual scenes here. Now, this image here, while I was in Belize, down south of the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, I was there with my wife, and I was there with Jocelyn, James and Jocelyn Hodgins. James is the co-founder of WS Photo Success. And here we were walking around downtown. We were there to go scuba diving, but you know, we took a day off, went downtown to get some cappuccino, something my wife loves to do. We see this cappuccino shop. And I looked at the scene and I said, classic example, this is what you see all the time. Very dark, dark chairs, counters, dark background, and a large part of the wall is dark. Okay, so I pull out my Canon G11 on aperture priority at 2.8. And I could see by previewing, and you got to do this a lot, you got to preview the image and look at your levels in camera while you're shooting on aperture priority. If you have any doubts, if you have to make an adjustment, you have to look at and know where your exposure is. Oh, I forgot to mention too, the other reason why it's not a good idea to shoot raw and compensate later, and there's proof to this. I've seen tests, and I can get into it, but that'll be another tutorial down the road. When you compensate, or when you pull in tones later, because you're shooting raw, like I mentioned, don't want to be lazy about this and avoid the opportunity to learn how to create good exposures. But the image pixels will still be degraded, even if you're using raw. I've seen proof, I've seen it. It's technically proven that you still are compromising the integrity of the pixels. And of course the solution is, and always will be, and we've been harping on this since day one, learn how to get good exposures. So I look at this scene and my camera says, hey, too dark, we gotta lighten it up. And I took an exposure, looked at my preview, and it was blinking where Tina's top is here. It was flashing, it's overexposed, and you can see the proofs in the pudding by looking at the levels. We've hit the wall. All right, so I know I gotta compensate. So let's get rid of that image. So what I did was, I said on camera, I had to decrease the exposure, so I went -1. Now if the scene was too light, and it was doing the opposite, was making it too dark, I'd have to go the opposite, I'd have to go +1. So you have to know when to go minus, when to go plus. You can do this manually, by the way, if you wish, and if it's, you gotta add more light or take away light, just do it manually, but I just use the compensation button on camera. So here we have a scene where I've went -1, so I increase the shutter speed, same aperture, and you can see the exposure is getting better, but we're still hitting the wall there. You can see right there, bingo. That may be okay because some of the tones, the lights and whatnot are over the edge. So just as a safeguard, I went and took another shot. So somewhere between that last exposure and this one, probably this one is actually more accurate, and you can see by the levels. We're hitting the wall to the shadows just, but all the details there, you see it all, it's dark. I want those pixels to go dark. So I know using that computer of all computers, the one between my ears, that I have to get a good exposure using certain compensation techniques. Now here's how it applies in the real world when I'm out shooting a wedding. You see this a lot. I use aperture priority a lot on a wedding. So here I am shooting this bride. It's a very light scene, and you see this a lot on weddings. Obviously, you got white dresses, often light flowers, and I've got a white set of curtains in the background, light pouring in, which is a nice look. It's kind of dream-like, but I know the camera's going to want to darken this. I know it's going to want to darken this. I know it. So I got to crank in an extra stop and a half, sometimes 2 stops in a situation like this. Otherwise, there's going to be very little detail in her face and whatnot, and it's going to get very dark and muddy in the area of her dress and flowers. So compensation time in camera, I just know this, and I know I have to do what needs to be done to get that exposure proper. And here again, the opposite. We got guys in their black tuxes, which is what you see again on weddings, and especially when I come in and I shoot detail shots of the guys with the flowers and the bow tie and that, when it's very, very dark, just like the scene of my wife at the cappuccino bar. Very, very dark, and I know the camera is going to want to brighten it up, but I don't want it to go bright because it's dark. They're almost black. So I have to compensate, right? So I have to decrease the exposure, decrease the amount of light hitting the sensor. So. And that's it. That's it in a nutshell. That's how aperture priority works in the field, in the real world. And if you want to check out many, many, many hours of tutorials, video tutorials of us on location, us teaching at Inferno workshops, us teaching all over, and or doing photographic sessions, not based on academic theory and not based on textbook, but what really works in the field, check out No BS Photo Success and consider becoming a member, an Inner Circle member. Thanks. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and I'm signing off. Rob Provencher here from No BS Photo Success.